Welcome to your 5-letter word. I'm your host, Christina, and in each episode, we explore how intentional communication and a strong mindset can transform your business, your relationships, and your personal growth. Whether we're covering communication strategies or sharing tips to shift your mindset, this podcast will help you learn to create more meaningful conversations in your life so that you can deepen your relationships and grow your business. So sit back, relax, and soak in the insights as we dive into today's conversation. Welcome to this episode of your 5-letter word. Today, we're doing things a little bit differently. The following is an excerpt from my Active Listening Masterclass, diving into the inner work that needs to be done first in order to hold the emotional and mental space for others to have an effective conversation and to listen well. If you're interested in purchasing the full masterclass, the link is in the episode description, or you can go to christina80.com/active-listening-training. Let's jump right in. Often, when we are having a conversation with others, what comes to mind? All of the inner chatter, the monkey mind, the inner dialogue that we're often talking to amongst ourselves while others are speaking to us. That looks a little bit different for everyone, but it's usually something along the lines of thinking of a response, thinking about your to-do list with maybe the 7,000 other things that come to mind instead of that conversation right now, and you can't believe the person's still talking. It's the running train of thoughts that we are hearing that distract us from the conversation that's being had. Now, although this is normal, this is an important distinction to make, because when you are a leader, when you are leading a team, when you are talking to team members or colleagues, it is important to hear and understand what they are saying. Because think about this. When is the last time you had a conversation with someone else and you could tell they weren't in it? Sure, they may have been standing there physically, they may have been nodding along, but you could tell their mind was elsewhere. How good does that feel? Not good at all. What if you are notoriously doing that to others? How effective of a leader do you think you are being if your team members, your colleagues feel like they're not being heard, especially if this is a pattern or a cycle that goes on? Okay? So it is very important to understand this fundamental concept that in order to have effective conversations, in order to listen to what others are saying, we need to have the mental and the emotional capacity to give them our attention and give them the time to listen and to engage accordingly. Okay? So in order to have that emotional and mental capacity to share with them, we need to create it within ourselves first. So what does that look like? Well, the very first step is understanding that when someone comes to you to have a conversation, they usually fall into one of two camps. They either want to be heard or they want to be helped. Think of a time when someone came to you and they were just venting, and they just wanted to get something off their chest. If you gave them a suggestion in that moment, do you think they found that suggestion helpful, or did they just find it annoying? Did they come up with reasons why they didn't want that suggestion? Did they shut it down? Right? Because when someone enters a conversation with the intention that they just want to be heard, they just want to vent, they just want to talk through something, that is not a time to suggest recommendations. That is not a time to jump in with solutions, because there's too much of a mismatch there. Okay? On the other hand, the other camp is individuals who want to be helped, who come to you and start a conversation because they're looking for a solution, right? Individuals fundamentally have a different way of processing their thoughts. Some people really like to focus internally and think, weigh the pros and cons until they come to a solution. Other individuals need someone to talk to so that they can bounce ideas around, that they can verbalize their thoughts, hear it out loud, and process it that way. Other individuals are a little bit in between both camps. They don't quite know what they want. They don't quite know what they're thinking, and they need that guidance. They need someone to help them process their thoughts to get there. Now, this is important to understand because when someone comes to you to be heard, it is important to give them that space to vent, to make them feel heard so that they are validated, they feel good, they're able to move on with the conversation. When someone comes to you to be helped, it is important to identify that they're looking for help so that you're able to guide them along appropriately. Once you start to identify what their type of thinking and thought process is, and whether they're looking for direct help and direct suggestions, or whether they're looking for indirect guidance, so that you can help them clarify their own thoughts, their own thought process, and come up to a conclusion that works for them. Okay? So fundamental difference, are they looking to be helped or are they looking to be heard? Okay? First thing to know. Second thing to start paying attention to is, what is your default style in a conversation? Now, what do I mean by this? When someone starts talking to you, what do you automatically start to think about? Okay. So over the next few days, while you're having conversations with others, I want you to start noticing. As you're having a conversation, stop and internally check in with yourself and think about, where is my head right now and what am I automatically jumping to? Okay. So there are 4 camps that people fall into. The first being solutions. So this looks like someone is talking to you, someone is telling you something, and without even considering whether they want to be helped or heard, you are just jumping in with solutions, with recommendations, with here's how to fix this. Okay? You are the fixer. You just want to get it done, move on, next. That's the first camp. The second camp is really the process person. Is someone coming to you and having a conversation and you are automatically thinking about what is the step-by-step that needs to be done here, right? So it's a little bit different than solutions. Solutions is more so, here's what needs to be done, the ultimate outcome, versus process and step-by-step is, well, first you should do this and then you should do that and then maybe this should be next. And it's that step-by-step sort of logical approach to it. Now, the third camp is really reacting in an emotional or relational way. And that looks like focusing more on the emotional aspect of them and their story and the relationships within the conversation. So someone comes to you with a problem, but rather than here's what you need to do or here's the steps you should take, the emotional camp looks more like, how are you feeling? How did this affect you? What did this person say? What's your relationship with that person looking like now? What is the impact of what happened between the parties involved? That's more relational. Now, the fourth camp. The fourth camp is, if you find yourself in it, please make note of it and start to shift into one of the other camps. The fourth camp is really judgment and criticism. And this is the camp where someone comes to you, they're telling you something, and it's just automatic judgment and criticism of what they did, what happened, what other parties did in the story. Okay, so this looks like, well, why would you do that? Oh, what were you thinking? Well, obviously that happened. And this is the least effective camp to be in. Because being on the other side of that conversation and hearing that judgment, hearing that criticism, especially if it's coming from your leader, it's not a fun place to be. And it's not a place that people will willingly keep coming back to. This is problematic because if you are a leader who falls into this judgment or criticism camp, what you are doing is really creating a pattern and a cycle of distrust and resentment between you and your team. Okay? So, just to recap, up to now, over the next few days, as you're having conversations, the 2 things you're going to start really paying attention to is, number 1, do you feel like this person wants to be helped or heard? And number 2, what is your default reaction? Are you falling into the camp of the solution? Are you falling into the camp of the process? Are you falling into the camp of the relationships? Or are you falling into criticism? Okay. Starting to identify this is really key because the awareness of what your default reaction is gives you so much context and insight into how you are approaching conversations and where you need to shift to start becoming a better active listener. Now, fundamentally, when someone wants to be heard, the approach that you will take will differ. It will likely be a lot more emotional and relational. When someone wants to be helped, That's where you can fall into a little bit more of that process or even a little bit of that task and solution oriented camp. But until you have that fundamental understanding of this is what they want, and therefore this is the approach that I should take, conversations just won't go well from the get go. And that's important. Number two, something to start considering for yourself as you're doing the inner work is really taking note of anything that is a trigger for you. Now, a trigger doesn't have to be something that is a big emotional reaction. It doesn't have to be something that triggers you so extensively that you just cannot have the conversation anymore. No, start identifying both the big triggers and the small triggers. What do you find annoying? What do you find frustrating? What types of things trigger you to want to roll your eyes or shut the conversation down or fall into that criticism camp because you think it's stupid, as an example, right? Those small triggers matter too. Because again, being on the other end of the conversation, especially if something starts to be a pattern with you as the leader, that's not a good thing. If you are falling into the pattern of being easily annoyed or easily frustrated, well, what you're telling your team members is that you don't want them coming to you with perhaps challenges or small issues that they're facing. Even if you're not saying that directly, your reaction is letting them know, hey, this leader, they're not a good person to come to when I'm struggling. And what's going to happen is they're going to hold off and let the struggle escalate until it's so big that they have no choice but to tell you. And dynamically speaking, that's not a good team dynamic to create. Instead, what you want to work on is starting to identify the triggers, again, big and small, so that you can develop awareness of them. It's once you have awareness of what your triggers are that you can start noticing them in the moment. Once you're noticing your triggers in the moment, that's when you're really in a position to change. That's when you're in a position to really shift your mindset and start creating the emotional and mental space for other people to have a conversation with you. As an example, let's say every time your team member came to you with a question, you were physically annoyed. Even if you feel like it was just eternal, there's always signs of our annoyance unless we learn to be very good at mitigating it. So let's say you were annoyed. So as a result, you were very brief with your responses. Maybe your tone changed to be a little bit more rude. Maybe you were rolling your eyes and just showing signs of frustration, right? Once you have awareness of that, that's when you can start working on creating space for your team member to share that with you and for you to work through a solution so that it stops happening. Once you have created the space within yourself to hold that conversation with them, once you can enter the conversation, actually listen to what the problem is and help them process the problem and guide them through to a solution, that's when the issue will arise less frequently and maybe even be resolved entirely because you took the time to listen and act accordingly. But again, it starts with that internal space first to be able to hold space for others. Okay? So up to now, you are starting to identify whether people want to be helped or heard. You are identifying what your default line of thinking is in that conversation, whether you're jumping to solutions, processes, relationships, or criticism. And now you're also taking note of what your triggers are, big or small. What are the things that are frustrating you, annoying you, making you want to shut down from the conversation? Those are really important points to consider and fix. Okay, so when a trigger comes up, first of all, totally normal. Everybody has triggers. Everybody has triggers, but the difference here is you are going to learn how to handle your triggers. Okay? Depending on the trigger itself, there may be some internal work that needs to be done around your emotions, your beliefs, your mindset. If this is a trigger that is something from the past, such as a traumatic event, a very emotional event, something that's still lingering and causing trauma in the moment. Okay, I'm going to use the word trauma here very lightly, just to encompass anything that is really has happened in the past, but is still continuing to create a negative state and a negative emotional reaction in you. Okay, so this might look like something, again, something bigger. If there was a major fight that you're still holding resentment onto, if there was any sort of issue that hasn't been resolved and there's still tension, If someone mistreated you and now there's fear around new individuals mistreating you again, right? It could be larger trauma, or again, it could be smaller triggers that are still coming up. Is something annoying you repeatedly? It needs to be addressed. Is something frustrating you repeatedly? It needs to be addressed. Okay. So while you work on the internal mindset and beliefs of addressing that trigger, you're also going to work on addressing the trigger in the moment within the conversation. Now, here's what that looks like. Someone comes to you with a conversation, you feel the trigger activating you, and that may look like, number one, an emotional reaction where perhaps you were calm, perhaps you were happy, you were in one emotional state. And now that you've had that trigger activated, you're in a different emotional state. You may be angry, frustrated, tense. You may feel, negativity come up, whatever the case. Just recognize that it's happening. You may also have physical symptoms, anxiety, adrenaline, some shaking, some tension, any physical symptoms that accompany that emotional state, important to identify so you can address them. Okay? So you're in the conversation, you're being triggered, you're feeling your emotions activate, perhaps you're feeling some tension and tightness as well. Here's what you're going to do. Number one, you're just going to tell yourself and logically process this that you are triggered. In the moment, you are triggered. And now the reason I say this is because when you are doing the inner work and you are taking the time to identify what is triggering you and why, it becomes so much easier to logically separate that. If you know that you're being triggered in the moment by a colleague because 6 months ago, you got in an argument with them and you're still holding on to that resentment, logically speaking, it becomes so much easier to recognize, hey, I'm triggered right now. I'm feeling frustrated that this person's talking to me. I know that it's because I'm still resentful of what happened previously. I know that I'm still holding on to a grudge, right? That logical thought process makes it so much easier to accept what is happening and to work with it in the midst of a conversation rather than trying to put that aside, not identify what's going on to you and just feeling the emotions. Because what happens when you're emotional? What happens when you're emotional in a conversation is you become reactive. Rather than being calm, being logical, and being engaged in the conversation, when you are reactive, you let your emotions take over. And that's when the conversation goes sideways. That's when people say the wrong thing. That's when they say something that they regret later on. Okay? And I don't want that for you. So, thank you for listening to this episode of Your 5-Letter Word. I hope you found this excerpt interesting and it gave you some food for thought as you move forward in your everyday conversations and the way that you listen to others. Often, we don't talk enough about the inner work that needs to be done in order to have conversations effectively. So I feel like this is a great place to get you started as you move on with conversations in your day-to-day life. Take care, guys. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Your 5-Letter Word. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And as always, I love to hear about your breakthroughs. I'm here to serve your soul a cup of peace and a slice of joy. Until next time, take care.